Your microphone seems to be muted, Jane.
Undo that.
There you go. That's good.
All right, thank you. Better. And we'll go over here. Can you see my screen?
We will in a second when you share it.
Oh, well, that's helpful too, right?
Yep.
Go back over here. I did say share screen before, but let's try it again. So I'm saying share screen. Hopefully that worked. Yes?
Yeah.
All right, so you should see my PowerPoint slides now.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so good evening. My name is Jane Loda. My project is about improving student selection of college majors through the use of a mobile application-based information model. And okay, now we're gonna have to figure out if I can page down. There we go. Okay, great. So a little background on this project. The selection of a college major is a critical decision for students. It can be a high pressure situation for them. They can, at 16 or 17, feel a lot of pressure to make an important decision with potential long-term impact. Studies show 25 to 50% of students in 2015 entered college in an undecided major status. But studies also show that an increasing number of programs are defined as early as freshman year with the courseware that students need to take. So if they arrive in undecided status, they run potential risk of being longer in college or at increasing expense. And while many colleges are working really hard right now to keep tuition down, affordability of college is a big issue and big debate right now. And of course, a lot of students have very high debt, $1.2 trillion in national student loan debt right now. So curious about this issue as arose for me with my own daughter who just is now a freshman in college. And noticing that there's a paradox in the U.S. admissions process for kids so young, they have limited skills perhaps in decision making. Studies show they get inconsistent guidance from adults and guidance counselors and family members, and occasionally contradictory information from the colleges themselves on the process to follow to be successful. So what I found during the literature review is that there's a high variation in student readiness for this type of a decision. And while we would like to think of college, of course, as a learning journey in the beginning of lifelong learning journey, we also know that we want them to start with a strong foundation. There were several studies I came across that indicated, for example, that if students get a job later in life that is not a match for what they studied as an undergraduate, they have as much as 40% deficit in potential earning income over the course of their various careers. That undergraduate foundation and confidence of coming out of school successfully and finding a job is really critical. Unfortunately, for high school kids, only they know what's interesting to them. So they need a healthy dose of self-awareness to approach this process. And many select colleges in the studies that I found based solely on liking the look of the campus or for an emotional reason, and that can increasingly be a costly thing. So what I learned is that there are kind of 4 starting points for students. They have interests from high school that they know. They have current life experiences to date. Perhaps they were injured in sports and they went to a physical therapist and learned that physical therapy exists and got interested in that as a career. They've also heard of careers or jobs from adults that they know. And there are kids who are literally interested in everything and learning everything and can't decide. So this project seeks to answer the question, how can a mobile application for college-bound or early undergraduate students presented through information design and decision science principles assist them in determining their ideal college major? And so during the literature review portion, what I decided I would like to learn towards this mobile app project is a little bit about information design and mobile app development. I'm a instructional designer in my work on a daily basis, but I've never designed a mobile app, so I thought that would be kind of cool to learn about. I will not actually be developing a mobile app for this project, but I will be mocking up the design and requirements piece for this model. I also realized I would need to learn about the current methods and tools available that students use today so that I could incorporate that thinking. How teens use mobile apps today and what designers consider when they're making something for teenagers. And a little bit about decision-making theory for some weighting and decisions that I'll show you in the model in a minute. So across the board, I'm looking to learn a bit about information presentation in a mobile app format, a little bit about decision selection, and how knowing your user audience influences design. So I'd like to enable students in this project to experiment with their own readiness level, frame of reference. So do they want to compare careers? Do they want to compare major fields or other personal areas of interest? Maybe they know their subjects they were good at in high school and they want to weigh those. And I want to translate these broad fields into a visual image that the user can then play with. To help get more information about different majors and their relationships to each other. So I'd like to guide the student from their current level of decision or research readiness, let them select 3 areas of interest from drop-down selections, and present the choices visually as a triangle. And this method came from a method that I ended up using with some of my daughter's friends. She fortunately fairly quickly knew what she wanted to do, but she started bringing home kids in her high school class who had no idea what they wanted to study. And so I started using this method with them, and the interesting thing was it worked with all of the kids who came home and asked me about things. So it led me to ask about potentially doing this as a project. So this is a real example from Patrick. This is a young man who knew he liked music and sound. He had an interest in design, and he's an exceptional artist. So we put those 3 things as the vertices of the triangle, and I asked some leading questions to help fill out the sides of the triangle. So as they would respond to these kinds of questions in the app, major fields could appear visually on the triangle in a weighting kind of scheme. So you'll see those things that are most like the items at the vertices that are in the dark black capital font are displayed closest to a vertice, and then as you go down, each slope, that right-hand side, you can see as you move towards art from product design, the choices become more like art and less like design. And when you're in the middle, they kind of have elements of both. So the interesting thing was that using this method with different students, they all fairly quickly gravitated to one side of the triangle when they saw the choices compared. And they also, interestingly enough, started to realize they had something that was a stronger pull for them as favorites than other things in the vertices. But I'd like students to be able to put in, different sets of 3 and compare things, and we could make the fields that appear on the right-hand side something they could drill into. So if they say, well, what's manufacturing engineering? What do they do? You could highlight that or click on it and find out what does a manufacturer engineer do, what type of courses are in that field of study, and whether that's kind of a match for you. So some methods with this project in the proposed scope, I'd like to consider the logic that would be required to visually enable this model and enhance major selection. I would limit the scope to defining the requirements for the app and proposing a design with some mock-ups. Aim it at the teenage user community and comfortability. Include some reflection questions that would help inform the logic for the app, and with the intention that the app would supplement other resources that are available to students, really try to let them have a say in what they're interested in and drill into it and see patterns that emerge. The strategy or the model requires some weighting to occur to create visually where the majors would appear on the slope of the triangle. So the things that are very strong to one vertice would be closest to that vertice, and then you can see here as you go down the slope, the weighting would have to react to that. So something that's moderate to product design and moderate to art would appear in the vicinity of that center of the slope. This is using a software comparison process that I discovered called analytical hierarchical process or hierarchy process. It's used in a lot of software coding where there's weighting or comparison of options to make a decision. And this is similar to the weighting used when you do something in a search engine to determine what percentage match it is to what you were interested in. So there would be a table perhaps in the background of this app that would have the relative comparisons of the different choices in the pull down list, for example, to each other. So as the student's making selections, the image can be displayed. During the literature review and the background research so far, I've discovered that there are two software-based tools that are available today. Both are survey services and focused on this high school area. One is majormatch.com and the other is mymajors.com. Both of these software-based tools ask you behavioral questions, and they produce a printed survey response, like a report at the end that tells you you are most like an elementary education teacher and least like a chemistry major. One of them is a for-profit service, and the other one is a National Science Foundation funded tool. So I intend to look at these in more detail, and maybe I'll even have my daughter do them. It'll be interesting to see if her major comes out from the same, from the study. But what was interesting about these is you kind of are in a black box situation where you answer their questions and then out pops this report, and you don't really have a lot of opportunity to know what the logic is behind it or to influence it. And what I found was the kids really got into wondering why things were related on a slope, and then wanting to say, oh, try it this way now with that as the, a vertice, and let's talk about that. So I think it'd be cool for students to have an opportunity to have a little bit more manipulation of the choices and understand the relationships behind it rather than just get a set report. But there are strengths of some of the reflection questions that these tools offer, so I'm looking at them next. One of the design challenges is translating the lingo from high school to college and then to career. So, high school students know the courses that they take now, and they just know something as English, but when they go to college and they look at major fields, the names and the words are different, and sometimes that throws them off. This is a fairly straightforward example, but if you consider engineering or some, super technical choices, you quickly get into areas that kids have no idea what that means. So helping them make that translation is one of the challenges, I think, of this application. I have been progressing the project so far by asking learning questions for myself. That's one of the ways that I learn. So across those 4 areas that I did the literature review on for the project portion, now I would like to learn things that are in this peach color below. I'd like to learn how to present some alternatives visually, how information design principles that we've been learning all along may be specific to apps, a little bit about wireframing. I'm an instructional designer in my work now, so I know how to storyboard, but I'm just curious how it's different when you're wireframing a mobile app. So I'd like to learn a little bit about that with this project. Also, we were mentioning with Lindsay this design for small screen, and what are the challenges with that if that comes up. From the current tools and methods available, I'd like to understand the limitations of the triangle versus current surveys and those methods that are used today manually to, how those could translate perhaps to the app. A little bit about teens in the mobile app world, any special considerations for presenting to them, and how to visually explain the use of the tool and how the user will learn how to use the tool, as well as maybe consider some personas as stories. So here's the path Emily took to learn that she's really a biomedical engineer type thing. And then lastly, in the decision-making in theory, the weighting for the triangle and the kind of the methodology, the logic behind that, I think will be pretty cool to reason out. And this idea of power of 3, which I believe is a concept from mathematics, where when you compare 2 alternatives, you have a certain level of thinking about it, but when a third one is introduced, it forces or pries open decisions, and that's why I think the triangle is what came to mind working with the kids before. So one of the things that's kind of cool also for design is that I'm used to writing, desktop learning courses and instructor-led courses. So curious how much of the model the user would need to know up front for an app like this versus learning it by trying it and using it in visual presentation. So I'm used to thinking about things that, when you use something or do something, I'd like them to have the goal of finding a major that they like. So to me, that's a learning experience happening through the app to help them meet a goal. So I'm curious about that. I'm also curious about the layout and enabling them to experiment over and over without getting lost or losing their persistence and motivation to continue, and the challenges of that from a design standpoint. So I'm curious your thoughts and ideas and feedback. Appreciate your thoughts on the project and the scope.
Thanks, Jane. I think that's, I think it's really interesting. I still worried a little bit about scope.
Yeah.
What way do you worry about scope, Steve? Can you just explain your concerns?
Right. Just, I think there's a lot of things happening here, several of which could independently be a thesis project. And so I think the question becomes: do you want to go broad or do you want to go deep? At some point, those are decisions and trade-offs that you make.
Right.
And the idea is to touch a lot of different areas. And so it might be that but anyway, so Catherine, but I don't think you'd heard this before too much, so.
Yeah, I'm so impressed by both of these presentations tonight. I think you've clearly thought it through, and when you were talking about which of the new skills and knowledge you're planning to learn. Most of those I can't help you with. I think they're really good. But I just want to start with a compliment. I think that you did a great job explaining what you're doing. One thing I was a little stuck on was if we're talking sort of close-up level, those triangles.
Mhm.
I imagine that there are lots and lots of majors out there. I don't know how many, 100, 200, 800. Are those triangles, is that content that you're going to be taking from your experience, or is there some kind of standard way that this has been done before that you're translating into this app?
Yeah, so one of the things from Steve's Design Right Studio course was this idea that you can leverage lists that exist already, which I would probably try to steal shamelessly from. If there are, college guides that have lists of majors and things like that, I don't intend to create those from scratch per se, but I would like to try to show examples that would indicate how the weighting might work for the display of the information. They use a method of points, for example, to make one of the items out of vertice a higher number than things that are maybe in the center of the triangle or in a different location. So I think I could stay broad with the project and talk about how it might be accomplished in terms of a design without actually trying to code it. I'm sticking to finding articles that are about, here's 8 things to keep in mind for mobile app development. Here's, 6 mobile learning contexts to consider if you want someone to learn something as they're, clicking. So I'm staying broad at that level, but trying to make a quilt, if you will, out of, talking about how the app might be created.
Okay, I can totally see that. I guess when I think about talking with other professionals, if we were in our faculty meetings trying to decide the weighting, probably Steve and Ib and Russ and Ryan and I would have all different ideas of how artistic information design is versus how, where I think the weighting differs. And especially in those oddball, interdisciplinary, that are becoming less oddball all the time, right? So as far as the scope question, it seems like you could say, okay, I'm gonna do this really well with 10 majors, and I'm not gonna worry about, some of those others. But I also have a bigger question here, which is, are there any dangers to what you're proposing? For example, I have a child who's 20, and he chose a major that is just perfect for him, but he didn't even know that until this year, and he's a junior. So there's something to be said for having them go out there and discover a bunch of things, and that if they sort of get talked into being something sometimes. So that's and then I guess that's it. I'm just wondering if you're told that that's something you might be good at, what if are you closing the door on lots of other things that might?
Yeah, no, I totally get that. One of the things that I, think about this for is the opposite is also true. Several of the kids that I talked to had absolutely no idea what the name was for something they were interested in, but they could talk about analogies to it. They could say, I would like to do something that I can leverage my writing skills in a creative way, but around science. And I don't know what that is, because all I know about are reporters on TV, or, they didn't have a context that there was technical journalism, for example. So you had to translate that for them and then look at the college majors and say, well, what does that look like in college? Maybe that's 2 degrees. Maybe that's a major and a minor. And what I liked about the triangle was that there were a couple kids, there were 3 kids who came up with a major and a minor from 3 likes, and felt that they could, if they got into it and it wasn't what they envisioned, that they could maybe make the minor a major and flip it, you know. So it really, I think it really depends on the kid. I don't intend for this to be their only resource, of course. There's so many things that you learn just looking at the college websites too. But I was just trying to give them language for their interests so that they can drill into what those things are, instead of just doing a survey that's behavioral and doesn't consider, this combination idea.
So, yeah, Jane, because I know we have to get to our 8 o'clock.
Okay.
And so I have a couple of thoughts.
Okay.
I think the most innovative and interesting component of this, especially from an information design perspective, is actually your triangle, because it's a visualization tool. And so it's designed to, it's a way that you've come up with, and you kind of studied this and, think it works, that students could, or potential users could, visualize this complex college thing, majors, in 3 dimensions. Okay.
Right.
So and that's an interesting information design problem.
Yep.
That you could isolate that.
Okay.
Project on that. And your example happens to be college majors. But you might say that's really way too narrow. I'm not so much interested in that as I am in all of these different things. And I think you could do that as well. So you could sort of punt on that and do the entire project as a bunch of smoke and mirrors. And I've probably mentioned this to students before in this previous, students, but to give you an idea of how smoke and mirrors you can make things, in my graduate school experience, we were trying to describe interactive video before you could make interactive video. And so we had a video that had very specific cut points. So we were describing a commercial that you would click on a mouse and it would say, oh, I want to buy that. Click, oh, we'll be here in 5 minutes. But it didn't, you didn't have the technology. So I had a little kid's clicker toy. And in the demo, I was trained well enough during the presentation to hit click and the video shifted. And it created the simulation of people seeing interactive video. You can make that happen with your triangles. It doesn't have to be real. It can be completely in your imagination. So you can, like Catherine was saying, you do a really good job on 10 majors. You don't really have to do that good a job on 10 majors. You can really make it so that only one of the vertices actually shifts. The rest of it is static, because in your example, you're only changing one of the points. Or something. You can think through ways to get your point across. And that's an exercise in art as well, and design.
Steve, can I mention one thing?
Yes. So anyway, that's my 2 cents there. So
I think the key element here are that you're dealing with teens, and I really think that's a select group that you really need to think about. You're obviously looking at it in terms of a mobile application, but that could still, you've got to be real careful, because these are kids who are used to a lot of interactivity, a lot of sort of cartoons or animation, and you can only do so much. But I do think you need to think about your audience, because that seems to be where you're going. And I would say there's a little bit about game theory in there too, because that's where kids are coming from. But that's just something to think about. But I do think one other thing just to look at in the design textbook is progressive disclosure. Because what you need to do is you've got to stay at a very high level and then move down depending on their interests. And if you start showing too much too early, that can get confusing. You do want to give people insights, but you don't want to get too deep right away, or else it gets very complicated and just confusing potentially. So just watch about that. But I would, you mentioned this too. I mean, really talk to the teenagers. What would they like to see, and maybe even test it on some of them. But that's your audience. And I would go heavily in terms of how you attract that audience and keep them.
Right. Okay.
So there, you've got some feedback. I think it's really exciting in whichever directions you choose to take it, and we can certainly talk about that. I'll figure that you're probably going to do everything that you said you're going to do. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah, wonderful job, Jane.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, everybody.